I'm joined now by our panel of parliamentary journalists. Susan Delacourt is a columnist with the Toronto Star. Marieke Walsh is a reporter with the Globe and Mail. And Joël-Denis Bellavance is the parliamentary bureau chief for Presse. Good to see you all. Susan, let's begin with the latest alleged atrocities that we are seeing these images of in Ukraine, the allegations of war crimes against Russia. Canada is responding with more sanctions and a promise to fund the investigation by the International Criminal Court to make sure that happens. But earlier on the program, I spoke with the head of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. She said she's ashamed, in part, by Canada's response and very disappointed by the failure to supply more arms to Ukraine or provide funds for Ukraine to buy those arms itself. And I guess I'm wondering, how should these allegations and images of alleged war crimes we're now seeing out of Ukraine change, or could it change the response from Canada?
Well, you see everybody having the human reaction first, which is good, that we are not normalizing this. I think you've heard several leading people saying today, we don't want to get used to these images and we don't want to think that this is normal. Joe Biden, last week he was walking back his remarks on whether Putin was a war criminal, and now he more or less is saying so that he is. So what can Canada do? The answer, unfortunately, and I hear what the criticism. Unfortunately, the answer is the same as it has been: is you're not going to see Canada getting out front of its allies on this. I watched Mélanie Joly's press conference today. She talks about working in concert with other allies, and I think the only way you're going to see Canada move on this is as part of a global alliance. And so far, they believe that's worked. Not probably as well as they should have, but the eternal question is, what would stop Putin from doing this, and what would stop this? What can Canada do? Right,
Marieke, what are your thoughts on this? Lots of outrage to go around, but not a whole lot so far in the way of any dramatic new action to stop Russia.
Absolutely, and I think that's exactly the question, Peter, is that Canada announced more sanctions today on non-Russians, non-Belarusians, but that's not going to change what's happening in Ukraine, as we've seen, because we've already had sanctions. Mélanie Joly talks about doing more at meetings that will be discussed later this week, politically and financially, but we also see that the West has made the calculation that citizens will only go so far in accepting sanctions. We see that they're not willing to accept, for example, much higher gas prices that would come with cutting off Russian gas supply. So there are limits to what the West will tolerate in terms of its own financial pain or blowback from what it's imposed so far. Whether that changes now, we'll see. But clearly a calculation has been made up until this point.
It's what do you think, if anything, changes in the days and weeks? One assumes, Joël-Denis, that as the Russians start pulling back from some of these small towns that they had occupied, we're going to see more of these images. And I'm wondering how you think that's going to affect the response in this country.
Well, that's the expectations as Russian troops leave the territory of Ukraine, that we will discover more of those images, horror images. Now, one of the means that Canada could use is using the UN and try to convince other like-minded countries to try to establish a UN peacekeeping mission. There's a war over there. There needs to be some agreement between the two parties, but Canada could use its diplomatic weight in the UN to try to maybe persuade other countries that it's time to evoke the idea of sending a peacekeeping mission. So we're good at that. Other than that, Canada, I think, has done what it could do. We've sent all the lethal weapons we have. Our reserve is empty right now, apparently, so we don't have any more munitions to send. So there's a critical problem. And maybe there's a budget coming up this week. Maybe the finance minister will put aside some money to help more Ukrainians buy more weapons. But that remains to be seen. But one of the ways to do it is use the diplomatic weight we do have, because we have a huge Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and use it to plead for a peacekeeping mission to try to maintain some order in Ukraine.
You touched on the budget, Susan. Let's pivot to that. We'll get a budget on Thursday, and indications are it's going to have a lot of stuff in it because there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of promises being made. What will you be watching for in particular?
I've been really obsessed lately with this question of the blue liberals, the people who like being liberal socially but are liberal, lean more conservative blue fiscally. And I watched in Question Period today as Conservatives were evoking the ghosts of Jean Chrétien and John Manley. and Paul Martin. As their heroes, which was an interesting thing. I think you've seen everything, but today it was the Conservatives are in the tradition of Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien. They were trying to sort of shame the Liberals back to their 1990s roots, which I hear talk of in Liberal circles. You do hear that, but so I'm going to be watching for what signals are being sent to the blue centrist base of the Liberal Party with this budget.
All right, Marieke, what about you?
Well, I think going off that, so far the signals or the telegraphing ahead of the budget is to not expect very much for those blue Liberals. You know, with the NDP Liberal deal on pharmacare, on dental, there will be more spending. We're expecting more spending on defense in response to the war in Ukraine. Then there's the $9 billion in climate money that was announced last week that will be in this budget. So you can see those dollar signs ratcheting up really quickly. And then on top of that, there's still questions about how much they'll do on housing affordability, which they say again and again is what their response is to the cost of living crisis. So I agree with Susan. I'm hearing from some people who are uncomfortable with how far the spending has gone, but I'm not seeing any signs that it will stop in this budget.
All right, Joël-Denis, what will you be watching for?
Well, the deficit figures, will they increase? Will they be stable? Will they decrease? Ottawa will get more money as a result of higher oil prices, for example, higher commodity prices. So money will be coming into the coffers, but as Marieke mentioned, they will be coming out as well as fast to spend on some military new measures, new equipment maybe, and also the alliance, the pact between the NDP and the Liberals will cost a lot of money. So there's a lot of investment coming up. And Blue Liberals, I talked to today, some of them, they're desperately looking for a new option now that the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau has gone clearly to the left with the NDP.
There will be budget measures, Marieke touched on it, to support the new climate plan unveiled by the government last week. Susan, today we saw a new report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change blaming Canada and other countries for failing to live up to pledges on climate action and warning again that urgent action is needed. Do you get the sense the government is committed to that urgency that has been described by that international panel today, that it's living up to that sense of urgency with the plan it unveiled last week?
I get the sense that the government is seized with it, to be frank. Justin Trudeau and the ministers, Stephen Guilbeault, all looked quite seized with it last week when they were talking about it. I think one of the problems is they have to get the public seized with it too. And, you know, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said the pandemic was a way of getting all Canadians sort of focused on a single goal. But we're seeing more and more that the idea of controls or changing people's lives is not as easy as we thought it was. There's a lot of blowback. So I think, yes, it depends a bit on whether the government's seized with it too. But my worry is that, like Marieke was talking about in a totally other context, is the public seized with this? You know, is the public going to make the sacrifices to do it? And when mask mandates seem too much, you know.
And Marieke, I mean, you look to your government for guidance on these things, and you know, I think you were on the news conference today with Stephen Guilbeault, I spoke to earlier on our program, and this challenge with being committed to reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector, but you know, in the next next 9 days, we're going to get a decision on Bay du Nord, the big oil drilling development off Newfoundland. There's still fossil fuel subsidies in this country. So is there some contradictions in the Canadian approach versus what we heard from that international report today?
The Liberals say no, and Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault was asked about that today several times because they're putting a cap on emissions. And so the companies that want to continue producing and sending these fossil fuels out and selling them will need to figure out a way to do it with less carbon intensity. Now, the question is how you do that, and that goes exactly to now we have a plan. The critics are saying, and the activists are saying, okay, so how do you actually implement it to make sure it happens? So how do you cut 42% of emissions from the oil and gas sector in the next 8 years when all it's done is grown in the last 2 or 3 decades? And that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where the time is running out. And Stephen Guilbeault acknowledged that, saying the government's going to somehow have to go from taking years to develop a policy to doing it in months.
What are your quick thoughts on this? The time is running out for us too, Joël-Denis, in 15 or 20 seconds here.
Yeah, quickly. There's regional competing interests in not using fossil fuels energy. You think about Bay du Nord. The cabinet is divided over this. Minister Regan, the minister from Newfoundland and Labrador, is in favor, but Stephen Guilbeault is against it. Christopher Lay is in favor. So you need to fix that before you can go full steam ahead in fighting climate change. When you've got competing regional interests fighting over them at cabinet level.
All right. Lots to watch. Budget this Thursday. Thank you all for your time. We'll talk again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.